In this section, we will get a basic overview of understanding by design. We will go into more depth in the later sections to go over the 3 stages of understanding by design. So understanding by design is really based around this fact of understanding. And so when you really start thinking about it, really think about what is understanding and what does it really look like in the classroom. And that's really the whole premise behind this understanding by design process for developing curriculum. This kind of came about several years ago, but this is a good example of why we look at understanding. So this was a test question on the NAEP 8th grade constructed response. So the question, how many buses does the Army need to transport 1,128 soldiers if each bus holds 36 soldiers? And 30% of the students answered 31 with a remainder of 12. This shows that the students know how to do the math, but they don't really understand how to apply that information. And so they're lacking that real understanding portion of this problem, and that's why we're taking a look at what is really understanding. So when we break this down and look at it, so students know information if they can restate, retell, regurgitate, those types of things. But we want to take the students beyond just that knowledge level. We want to get them to that understanding level. And so when you're thinking about understanding, a student can show that they understand something when they're able to apply what they've learned in class, taking that information and applying it to something in their lives or something in the real world. They're able to use that information and apply it in that process. Are they able to transfer information from your class to areas outside the class or other content areas? And are the students able to create something based on the knowledge that they've obtained? So this is what understanding by design is all about. It's getting all of our students to that understanding level. So when you break it down, understanding by design really says that there are 6 different facets to really show that a student understands something. So if we take and we look at the first one, explanation. So this is really just the students explaining how they found their answer. So if they're talking about a math problem, can the students explain how they came to their answer? Can the students explain the functions of a cell rather than just rather than just labeling the parts of the cell? When you get into interpretation, so we want students to be able to interpret that information. We want them to be able to draw those inferences, and asking a student, what does the author mean? Or in this passage, what is the purpose? So they're able to take the knowledge that they've gained, and now they're able to show that they understand it by doing some of these different things. And then when you get to the application level, students can apply that knowledge to their life or the world around them. A word problem in math, or examples of abuse of power in politics, or examples of freedom of speech when the students are learning about First Amendment. So again, taking the knowledge that they have and be able to apply it to something else. So apply that information. So when you get into the perspectives, providing students with different points of view. For example, students looking at different views and opinions of imperialism, or the debates of adopting the Constitution, or views on global warming. So giving them 2 different perspectives or more perspectives and having them really dive in and really look at that, so they're really analyzing those different points of view. So when they can get to that point, when they're looking at those different points of view and then forming their own thoughts and opinions on the matter on their own, they're taking it to that next level. So they're really able to show that level of understanding. So when you get into the empathy, students understanding how another person feels. So, like students learning about the Trail of Tears. How did the Native Americans feel as they were going through this process? Women's rights, looking at the different ways that women felt about these issues as they were trying to gain more rights, like the right to vote. Or looking at the civil rights movement and what some of those African Americans were going through and what they felt when they were trying to get equality. And then when you get into the self-knowledge, looking at one's own thinking and learning, like students journaling, providing feedback, and students are revising their work, those different types of things. So as we are writing our learning experiences, think how these activities are taking the students to that understanding level rather than just the knowledge level. So as you're building some of those activities and you're building those lessons and learning activities, you're really taking this, and it's like, I don't want the students just to know this information, but I want them to understand this information. And so we're building our lessons with that in mind so that we're trying to get those students to that understanding level. So one of the things when you're designing your units, we want to kind of avoid what's called the twin sins of unit design. So as we move and start thinking about designing these learning experiences, it's important to keep in mind that these are a couple of things that we really want to avoid. So when we're looking at that activity-oriented teaching, we want to go beyond just confusing hands-on work with minds-on work. So just because the students are doing hands-on work does not necessarily mean minds-on work. Think about how the activity contributes to the learning of the skills or concepts we're trying to achieve in that lesson. One example that I use, I found this really fun activity when the students were learning about the progressive movement and looking at the different characters and events that were taking place during the progressive movement and comparing it to the movie Wizard of Oz. So I went in and I pulled up different clips from the movie Wizard of Oz, and then I had the students comparing the different characters in Wizard of Oz to the historical figures that we were studying. This was a really fun activity, but it really didn't help the students understand the information. And it's one of the things when I talked to the students, it was a nice, fun activity, but it did not really help the students understand the progressive movement. So thinking about that is, yes, it was very hands-on, but it really wasn't minds-on work because it didn't advance the students in what they knew. So when if you focus on content coverage, you're just going through the book or resource day by day, and the students are learning everything. But we have to think, is it all really necessary? Remember that textbooks are really generally written for 3 states, Texas, California, and Florida, and those books are aligned to the standards in that state, and they're not necessarily aligned to Minnesota standards. Now, a lot of those standards are going to cross over between both those states, but we need to think about the things that are more important than others and some things that we want to go more in depth on. So your textbook might have a paragraph or a statement on something, but it might be one of those major standards here in Minnesota, and so just having that one statement or one paragraph isn't enough for the students to get to that understanding level. And this is the reason why we spend a good deal of our time looking at examining and unpacking standards so that we really know what standards are, so we can focus our instruction based on what the standards are and make those adjustments and possible add-ons that are needed because of what the students need to know. So really, UBD is just a planning framework. It is a way to purposely think about our planning. It's really focused on those big ideas and develops that understanding and makes meaning of those big ideas. And then once we understand those big ideas, we can start progressing and making those steps. So UBD is really a backwards design planning framework. And so this is what we're going to be using as we go through the curriculum writing process in the school district. So when we're focusing on those big ideas, I want to take you through what the 3 stages of that backward design are. So, as a district, we will be following the Understanding by Design framework to write curriculum for our classes. As you go through this process, all the activities we complete in the process and the order in which they are completed is following the Understanding by Design framework. So later on, we're going to kind of get into the timeline and talk about when things are done and how they're done and those types of things. And all that is based on this framework. So our first step in the curriculum writing process is identifying desired results. This is determining what it is we want our students to know. And then through this, we need to first go through the standards. We will unpack the standards first, and then from there, we will determine what the students will be learning in the course, and then begin mapping out the sequence of learning. The second step is to determine the acceptable evidence, or how will we know when the students have learned the information. This will be done through developing assessments. When we write the assessments, before we begin the planning and writing the learning experiences, by developing the assessments, it will help us understand what specifically we need to have in the learning experiences so that students can be successful on the assessments. And then lastly, we will go in and start planning the learning experiences or the lessons. So this goes against traditionally what we've done in the past. In the past, we've kind of go in and we write our lessons and then we write our assessments. And then with this, the research says that if we flip this process around and we go and we know what the students want to know, and then we go and say, this is the evidence that will show that they learned it, and then plan the learning experiences. As I mentioned before, when you know what you're assessing, that helps you actually build the lessons. And so this is a process that we're going to be using as we go through and we write curriculum this summer.